Well, I'm not sure he could give you a different answer. Remember that the people we're talking about in Washington are universally ideologues. And given their ideological mindset, a discussion with anyone who disagrees with them is impossible. Anyone who opposes American policies in any form, particularly military policy, strategic policy, is by definition an enemy. I mean, this is the sort of, remember, this was the George Bush message: you're with us or you're against us.
Mm.
This is ridiculous nonsense. But we're not interested in winning anything. We keep talking about helping Ukraine win, but what does a win look like? Has anybody ever described victory?
I don't think that they can define a win. It can't be the removal of Russian forces from Crimea. That's not even militarily conceivable. It can't be the removal of President Putin from office. These are probably on the wish list of Victoria Nuland and maybe Tony Blinken, but these things are not realistic.
Well, from the neocon or globalist standpoint, if anything they do harms Russia and its leadership, it is by definition strategically positive for the United States and its allies. I don't subscribe to that view. But then again, people don't think carefully when they start wars about how to end them. And if you take the position that the only way the war can end is with the complete destruction or near complete destruction of your opponent, the war is not likely to end anytime soon, and sometimes never. Unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with.
Colonel, President Zelensky gave an interview in English to an American reporter. I don't recognize her, and I don't know the name of the network for which she works. They're on a train. We're going to run this in just a minute. There's a little bit of background noise from the train, but you can hear what they're saying. The essence of what he's saying is he needs, I don't know if he understands this properly. He needs to win Bakhmut, and President Putin needs to win Bakhmut for PR reasons. So take a listen, and then maybe we can dissect what he says.
Is this part of why you are fighting so hard in Bakhmut? Because a lot of military analysts will say that strategically it's not that significant.
Because that will be victory for him. He will.
And any victory.
Yes, he will sell this victory. He will sell this victory to West, to his society, to China, to Iran, to all the countries, to Brazil, to Latin America countries, not to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Of course, they really understand, from details, and they feel this dangerous because they neighbors. So, but he will sell it to his society. That was the first step. Now, wait a minute. I will have decision with Ukraine. Then another step.
Is Bakhmut militarily significant, strategically significant, or just emotionally, PR-wise significant?
I think most analysts that have looked at Bakhmut recognize that town is the keystone in the edifice of the defense of Donbass. That once that falls, because of its unique position, the road networks that run in and out of it, rail lines, the various factory installations, mines, presumably supply depots and other things, it is very important. And that once it is taken, it's questionable how you build another effective defense line on the scale of the one that you had in Donbass. So I think it is very important, and I'm sure he knows that. As far as PR is concerned, he may not realize what a PR disaster he now has on his hands, because he's effectively saying that he's sacrificing tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives in order to convey the impression that, first of all, Ukraine can still win, but he argues to deprive Putin of some sort of PR success story. The Russians have a lot of capability right now, a lot of forces. They're not moving because they're not going to slug their way through the sea of mud that has famously stopped armies for centuries. They're waiting for that to dry out. They are going to attack when it dries out. He knows that. He keeps trying to build this argument for an offensive that he's going to launch that will preempt the Russians. No one has figured out how he does that through the mud. Maybe he has a super answer that no one else has got. And secondly, we're not really sure what kinds of forces he has at his disposal. What I sent you in terms of the map gives you a rough estimate, but those numbers for the Ukrainians are rather soft. The numbers for the Russians on the map are quite hard. It doesn't take a genius to figure out where the Russians stand on this, and they can slug it out very quickly when they decide to do so. So I don't think Putin's in any hurry, and I don't think he needs a PR victory.
Gary, let's put the map up. There you go. So, Colonel, how accurate are these numbers? I see 130,000 Russian troops. I see 60,000 Wagner forces. I see 50,000 Russian troops from Donetsk. I see another 50,000 Russian troops on the bottom. I can't tell what country that is. I don't know if that's Crimea or where they're coming from. The Ukrainian forces appear to be less than half of the Russians.
Yeah, well, understand the 130,000 at the top are forces in reserve, uncommitted. That's very important. These are
but are they there? Are they there where they're shown on the map so that they can move east if needed?
Yes, they are. And they're spread out, though. They're not concentrated into a tight little ball for obvious reasons. So they're spread out from perhaps the top of the map down to the dark part in the center. But they can rapidly move north and south, east or west, because the road networks that the Russians control give them excellent lateral routes to reposition forces quickly. Now, the 60,000 Wagner troops, the 50,000 in Donetsk, Luhansk militias, and regular Russian forces fighting with them, where you see the curving red arrows around Avdiivka and Bakhmut, they're fighting right now. In other words, those are forces that are committed to the front. They're not all committed, but most of them are. And those that aren't are certainly in positions to defend. Then at the bottom, where you have the 50,000, these are the ones that are not far from Kherson, which is off the map to the left. Those forces are not necessarily in contact, but they are in defensive posture. In other words, they're ready for an attack if the Ukrainians launch it. Now, the point of this map is to look at the Ukrainian side. These numbers, 80,000 at the top and 40,000 to the left as you view it, those numbers were good a few weeks ago. We don't know precisely what they are because you'll see the dashed blue lines.
What does that mean?
That means that the forces that were formerly concentrated, as shown on the map, have been reduced in size and capability because they've had to move them to reinforce Bakhmut and Avdiivka. In other words, we may be looking at now 20,000 down to the left and maybe 30,000 or 40,000 up to the right because the rest of the forces have been drawn off to fight. Now, Bakhmut has reportedly fallen, which means they no longer have those defensive positions and are going to have to fall back further to the west if they're going to maintain any kind of coherent defense.
Colonel, let me interrupt you. Is this breaking news that Bakhmut has reportedly fallen, or is this a repetition of what we expected in the past week or so?
I have only received a direct statement that came to me from my sources that what you see, the distance between the two red arrows around Bakhmut is closed.
Do those arrows mean that Bakhmut is surrounded?
Yes. In other words, it's completely
surrounded by Russian troops.
Yes. And the Ukrainian forces, we're unsure how many are left. Maybe there are 3,000, 2,000, 4,000. But effectively, Bakhmut has fallen because those troops cannot be reached. They can't be reinforced, and they're on their own. So we'll see what that means over the next 24 or 48 hours. Do those forces surrender? Supposedly, a lot of Ukrainian troops have surrendered, talked about being isolated, having no support, having nothing to eat, having no more ammunition, and so forth. So at any rate, the point is that the totals that we thought were available just 2 or 3 weeks ago for counterattacks really don't exist anymore. It's something less than what's shown on the map. Secondly, they have to move across relatively open ground in order to reach the Russian lines. Now, this is a wonderful opportunity for the Russians because, as we've pointed out in the past, you have intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance platforms, manned and unmanned, from the ground all the way up to 30, 40,000 feet, low Earth orbiting satellites at 80, 90,000 feet. All of these can track with absolute perfect detail where the Ukrainians go. The result is that as soon as they are within, say, 10 or 15 kilometers of the Russian lines, they're going to be annihilated by artillery, rocket artillery, missiles, and conventional artillery. This is not a question of, well, the Russians have covered the road or the Russians have covered this. They've got the whole place covered. They're never going to get to the Russians. They're going to die in great numbers. So
Colonel,
why, in the circumstances, would the Russians move? You might as well sit and wait for what remains of the Ukrainian army to attack.
Wow. I want you to watch and listen to Senator Roger Wicker, Senate Armed Services Committee, interrogating the former four-star general who is now the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and tell me if you think the secretary is credible.
With regard to your optimism about Ukraine having the upper hand, that is what you told me yesterday.
It is. Now, what I was about to say, Senator, is that Ukrainians have inflicted significant casualties on the Russians, and they have depleted their inventory of armored vehicles in a way that no one would have ever imagined. And so now we see Russia reaching for T-54s and T-55 tanks because of the level of damage that the Ukrainians have inflicted on them.
Reaching for those tanks demonstrates what to you, sir?
It demonstrates that their capability is waning. We've continued to witness them be challenged with artillery munitions and other things, and they're reaching out to Iran, to North Korea.
Do you believe there's a real chance for significant Ukrainian advancements between now and the beginning of winter?
I believe there's a chance, and we're doing everything that we can do to ensure that they have their best opportunity to be successful.
All right, Colonel.
Well, in October, November of 1967, General Westmoreland indicated in a public speaking tour across the United States that he was more optimistic than he had ever been. He was immensely proud of the way Vietnamese forces were fighting and was confident that we were nearing the end of the beginning of victory in Vietnam. Now, I've also listened to Dave Petraeus, as a general, tell us that the Iraqi army was in first-class condition and quite able to take over the mission of defending the new Republic of Iraq, that elections there were successful, that democracy was reaching Iraq once and for all, and that we were winning. I listened to, General Dempsey. I mean, just go down the list of all the generals, including Austin, when he was in active duty, tell us how successful everything was and how good everything was, only to discover that none of it was true. Now, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we have killed integrity in the military. It just doesn't exist. Remember that a fish rots from the head, not from the bottom. If you want the truth, get a soldier, sergeant, lieutenant, or junior captain and ask him, what do you think? You're going to get the truth. He'll tell you the truth, or she will tell you the truth. But once you move above that, the higher you go, the more unrewarding telling the truth becomes. Because everyone above you wants good news. If you bring bad news,
from my end of the world, I look at it this way. The Secretary of Defense was under oath. This is not a game. It's a felony to lie under oath. It's also a felony to mislead Congress if you're not actually lying, if the impression you're creating is erroneous. Does he believe what he's saying?
Well, first of all, Judge, how frequently have we brought anyone in and held them accountable for having lied to Congress?
The last person prosecuted for lying to Congress was the New York Yankee pitcher Roger Clemens, who supposedly lied about the content of his urine. The first trial was a mistrial. The second trial was an acquittal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think
the government doesn't prosecute its own. We know that.
Yeah, well, if you're not going to prosecute, there's no accountability. Where there's no accountability, there's no performance. I don't think any of these general officers are worried in the least about being brought back and asked hard questions in the future when everything falls apart. So that's the first thing. Secondly, Many of these people convince themselves over time that they have a duty to lie. It's my duty to go in there and support the president and his policies. No, it's not. That's wrong. But that's what they have convinced themselves.
But they, in this case, he is betraying the soldier, the lieutenant, the junior captain, the people who have a real feel for what's going on, whether they're Americans or not.
Well, this is absolutely true. This was true in Vietnam. It was true during World War II, particularly for the German generals who, after the war, were asked how they could possibly have continued to do what they did and lie the way they did. They were ultimately held accountable, not all of them, but large numbers of them, fortunately. But there's no sense right now in the officer corps that if you're a 3 or a 4-star, that you have an obligation to tell the truth that might be embarrassing to your superiors, whether they're 4-star superiors or political appointees or the president of the United States himself.
Here's an interrogation before the same committee, just a few minutes after the one we showed you. I don't align, I don't think you do, with the ideology of the interrogator one bit. It's Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, who's a Lindsey Graham accolade and loves war. However, he does accuse Secretary Austin of lying. Now, it's not about Ukraine. It's about the notification of the military action in Syria. But watch the back and forth between them and tell me if a rational person could conclude that Secretary Austin is being truthful.
To the issue of the strikes in Syria last week and Senator Wicker's line of questioning about the timing of notification to Congress. You said that you, quote, should have notified Congress earlier. These attacks happened against our troops, killing one contractor early in the morning Eastern time. Do you believe that you should have notified us that morning while we were voting on amendments directly related to this kind of attack?
There is no connection between when we notified you, Senator, and your vote. The chairman and I were testifying that morning as well. So as soon as we came out of testimony, we began work on crafting response options.
Secretary Austin, I don't believe you. I believe that your office specifically withheld notification of this deadly strike against Americans because the Rubio Amendment, on which we voted midday, directly touched on exactly this scenario, not repealing these use of force resolutions if the president couldn't certify that Iran was no longer attacking us in Iran and Syria. That's what I believe. Nothing you can say is going to change my belief about that. And I got to say, I think I speak for about a lot of my colleagues.
I just want to say, Senator, that is absolutely not true.
Maybe you didn't personally do it. But I believe entirely that people in your office did that. You have a vast legislative operation, as Senator Wicker pointed out. Do you really expect us to believe that they didn't know that we were voting on a Rubio amendment that directly covered exactly this kind of attack? I don't believe that. I believe there's a conscious decision made not to inform Congress because you fear that it might lead to the passage of the Rubio amendment, which would kill the entire bill.
Does Secretary Austin have a reputation in the military community for being truthful?
You know, I would like to say that in most cases, general officers are not thought of as people who are going to tell the truth about things that might embarrass them or their administration. I mean, you'll recall that when Lieutenant General, then 3-star Dave Petraeus came back from Iraq in 2005 to testify on the subject of how things were going in the fall, that Senator Kerry said one of the few occasions, something that I could agree with that came out of his mouth. He said, we're going to discover that General Petraeus is going to tell us how successful General Petraeus is. And Kerry was absolutely right. So I think everybody in the military at lower levels knows exactly what goes on. Now, as far as the actual subject is concerned, you know, frankly speaking, every presidential administration knows that there are lots of people like Senator Cotton, or in other occasions it may be Rubio, or it might be Schumer or someone else, is anxious to take advantage of an event to either embarrass or harm the administration or to force through legislation that might otherwise not pass. So I'm sure he's accusing Austin of something that probably happened, but doesn't mean I have much use for Senator Cotton. I don't have much use for most of the people on the Hill who have failed to tell the American people the truth about almost anything. So you're dealing with institutions that have essentially codified lying as an acceptable behavior. So it's very difficult for me to get excited over it. I wish that we could change what goes on in uniform, but that would take wholesale change in the institution, widespread removal of people to get someone who tells you the truth.
Here's an interview that CBS had. Now I'm taking it to the other side of the world with Admiral Sam Paparo, a 4-star, who's the commander of all the naval personnel and equipment in the Pacific. And he's talking about, we're ready to defend Taiwan. And by the way, we're not talking to the Chinese.
If the U.S. and Chinese militaries can't communicate over a Chinese spy balloon, then what's going to happen when there's a real crisis in the South China Sea or with Taiwan?
We'll hope that they'll answer the phone. Else, we'll do our very best assessment based on the things that they say in open source and based on their behavior to divine their intentions, and we'll act accordingly.
Doesn't that make the situation even more dangerous if U.S. and Chinese militaries are not talking?
Yes.
I guess the last answer is a truthful one, but the one before that, he almost has to say that, whether he believes it or not. What is he going to say? The Chinese have a better Navy than we do. We might as well give up on Taiwan. He better put his retirement papers in.
It's troubling to me that an active duty 4-star is essentially behaving as a policymaker,
right,
and announcing policy. He has no business speaking publicly on any matter pertaining to policy other than to restate, if compelled to do so, what the current policy is of the President of the United States and his administration. That's not what he did. We have a huge problem with too many 4-stars. We have about 44 in active duty, and all of them view themselves as Caesarean figures, especially the regional unified commanders who think that they are...
Caesarean as in Julius Caesar, not in as the surgery that sometimes produces babies.
No, they end up thinking that they're Caesar, and that's what you heard from him. What will you do when X happens? And the answer should have been, I will do as I am instructed to do by the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief. That is where my orders come from.
All right, this next clip will aggravate you even more. This is Admiral Paparo talking about the capability of the U.S. Navy to neutralize the Chinese Navy. Gary?
Is it your hope that the power of the U.S. Navy, the force posture of the U.S. Navy, will deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
It's not my hope, it's my duty, in conjunction with allies and partners, to deliver intolerable costs to anybody that would upend the order in violation of the nation's security or in violation of the nation's interests. The saying, which is si pacem para bellum, which is, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Well, that's George Washington, although Washington said it in English, not Latin. If you want peace, prepare for war. But I get your point that an active duty military, 4-star or not, shouldn't be having an interview like this. We have many more of these clips. I don't know how much of this you can tolerate. It sounds like it was produced by the CIA. Sounds like it's propaganda.
Well, keep in mind that any admiral, if you ask him, are you ready and are you capable of defeating your enemy? He's going to tell you that he is. I would expect that. I would expect a general officer in the field to say the same thing. The only way to find out if that hypothesis is accurate is to test it on the battlefield or in a war at sea. That's not something he should talk about, but he said the right thing. And we are ready and we will fight if we have to. However, this business about deterrence is nonsense. His job personally is not to deter a damn thing. He's supposed to be ready to fight. It's not his job to provoke the Chinese, to intimidate the Chinese under any circumstances. His job is to be ready to fight. If he's called upon to do so, he's directed to do so. If he's fired upon, And that's it. And he should not be speaking extemporaneously on a whole range of topics. But this is more evidence that there is no one in charge in Washington.
I'll give you a little bit more evidence. After that interview, which took place in Guam, which, by the way, CBS describes as the size of Chicago. I didn't know that. I thought Guam was about the size of New Jersey, but it's the size of Chicago, according to CBS. So back in Washington, D.C., in the Pentagon now, I forget if it's a different reporter or the same reporter, but it's CBS. It's part of the same package. Interviews the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations, and he makes a rather damning admission. Take a listen. Okay, well, his admission is that the shipyards that build big ships during his tenure as the Chief of Naval Operations has gone from the 30s down to the single digits, and the Chinese are building 2 ships for every one we build. He concedes that they have the larger Navy. But how insane is it for Joe Biden to provoke the Chinese into attacking Taiwan because of this fanciful belief that we can somehow defend it?
Well, first of all, a Royal Navy submarine captain who was crossing the North Atlantic was in the vicinity of a U.S. Navy submarine captain who was headed in the other direction, and they hailed each other. And the American captain said, "How does it feel to be part of the second largest Navy in the world?" And the Royal Navy captain answered, "I don't know. How does it feel to be part of the second best?" This sort of thing this goes on. There's nothing wrong with that. And he's telling the truth. In terms of sheer numbers of hulls, certainly the Chinese have lots more of them. But about a third of all the ships, and if you're talking about 300, that means that 100 are effectively Coast Guard vessels. They exist purely for coastal defense.
This is in our Navy or in the Chinese Navy?
The Chinese Navy. And that needs to be understood. But, when you get into these discussions about being ready to defend Taiwan or something else, it's very dangerous. At the outbreak of World War II in 1941, we had 11 oil tankers in the Pacific for the United States Navy, which was larger then than the Navy we have today. 11 oil tankers. Well, the bottom line was that the Navy, as soon as we were attacked, was supposed to sortie the entire fleet, fight its way all the way to Corregidor, Manila, and relieve the beleaguered American garrison and tow behind it 2 divisions of Army troops. Well, the 2 divisions of Army infantry showed up on the docks at San Francisco, but the Navy didn't take them anywhere because they only had 11 tankers full of oil. That meant that if they had used those tankers, they might have gotten halfway across the Pacific.
And they run out of fuel? Wow.
Yes. In other words, we didn't have enough. Now, when you look at the Pacific today, we have 3 major hubs for logistics purposes. They're well known to the Chinese as they are to us. I'm not going to enumerate them here today. But if those 3 hubs are destroyed, which is very easily done with precision-guided missiles, then you're out of luck with the Navy in the Pacific. In other words, I'm trying to say we're not prepared to fight the Chinese any more than we're prepared to fight the Russians. So instead of talking about fighting them, let's talk about what we need to do to be ready. Let's understand what the president is instructing us to do and to get ready to fight. We don't need to provide lots of details on how ready or unready we are to the public. And again, that's why these 4 stars should not talk this way. There's wonderful correspondence that went on between the various 4 stars in the Navy and ultimately Marshall and MacArthur in 1940-41, talking about these issues. But publicly, MacArthur said, "We are ready. We can hold these islands and we'll defeat whatever is thrown at us, bluff, bluff, bluff." Right. Privately, he said, "We're lucky to hold out for 6 weeks. We don't have enough of anything. We need to spend billions of dollars. We don't have enough of this, enough of that." And Marshall knew it, which is why they all told Roosevelt, "Don't embargo Japan. If there's a war, we're not ready." And what did we get? Well, they fought very, very valiantly. In fact, we fought extremely well in the Philippines up to the last bullet practically. Launchers were altered, I guess. One was supposed to be used for a speaker on some sort of stereo system. I don't know what the other one was for, but they were given as gifts by a Ukrainian chief of police to the Polish chief of police with the hope of cultivating closer ties and cooperation. Somewhere along the line, the Ukrainians seem to think it happened after they sent it off to him, and that may well be true. I have no idea. A live grenade was found in this thing, and it accidentally or purposely exploded. We don't know, but it's a very hard to imagine how something like this could have crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland without being detected. I'm sure the Polish chief of police wasn't hiding anything.
How would this have been delivered? Not through the mail.
Well, I don't know. The sad part here is that you're well aware, as many of us are, that there's this long history of antagonism between the Poles and the Ukrainians. So this opens up that whole ugly chapter for discussion. Was this intentional, or was this in fact an accident? Nobody is able to answer it, except that right now the facts are what I sent you on email, and that's all we know.
What were the injuries to the Polish commander? Do we know?
Apparently none. He had maybe modest scratches or something, but no serious injuries of any kind were reported.
Okay. Do we still have a president of Poland beating the drum and acting as if his troops are going to get engaged? I think we do. Do we not?
Yes. Well, in the op-ed that I just finished that the American Conservative will have out tomorrow, I lead with the remarks of the Deputy Polish Minister of Defense, who is warning an audience on the 29th of November that this war is growing in intensity and Poland is likely to be involved in it, and hints at potential mobilization and a number of other things down the line. Now, since then, we've also had a source tell us that the Polish government is now looking at 200,000 troops that could be mobilized next year. All of this is disconcerting because, remember, inside the NATO alliance, Poland is really alone in its enthusiasm for aggressive war against Russia. Nobody else, with the possible exception of the Romanians, is interested.
Well, your piece is a scary one, Colonel. I mean, you start by summarizing the interview. We talked about this before, but we'll touch on it again. That General Zaluzhny had with The Economist magazine, and when he asks for 300 new tanks and 600 to 700 new infantry fighting vehicles and 500 new howitzers, you conclude he's not asking for assistance, he's asking for a new army, and he must know that this is not possible.
Well, one would think so, and I think they were trying to set the stage for a meeting with the United States in which they would get more other types of assistance, potentially convince us and maybe others in this so-called coalition of the willing to intervene and help them in some way. That's why I find it extremely disturbing, because President Biden has said from the beginning that we were not going to directly engage the Russians in a military confrontation. Yet we seem to be moving closer to that outcome. And the Poles, of course, I think would actually welcome that, which is very dangerous. This is the problem when you ally yourself with a relatively small state. The small state has a permanent interest in leveraging your power for their benefit.
Right. You point out that Ukraine hospitals and morgues are filled to capacity, and Ukraine with wounded and dying Ukrainian soldiers. How many healthy soldiers do they have remaining? Do you know?
Well, the last word that I had was they had 194,000 quote unquote effectives. And in the article, Zaluzhny mentions that he's got 200,000 combat ready troops, people that can fight. He has another 500,000 people in uniform, but they're not necessarily soldiers. They may be police, paramilitary, other kinds of functionaries, but they're not fit for frontline duty. And I think that's a huge admission, because it also tells you something about the enormous number of casualties that the Ukrainians have been taking.
Why is General Zaluzhny saying all this in public? Is there some purpose or goal to this?
Yeah, I think, again, he and President Zelensky know what I know and know what anybody knows who looks carefully at the assembling Russian force and its enormous firepower, standoff attack and direct firepower. And he's being honest. He's saying, well, their attacks could be stronger than we think, and we could be weaker than we thought later on in the article. In other words, it's a backhanded way of saying, look, this is very dangerous. We probably are not going to succeed against this kind of force. We've asked you for more. What are you going to do? In other words, the ball is in your court, Washington. And after all, we urged them to fight from the beginning. We've never come back and said, well, there's a point at which it makes no sense to fight on.
Would it be fair to characterize General Zaluzhny as the realist and President Zelensky as sort of has pipe dreams? And would it be fair to say that the Russians have far more respect for the general than they do for the president?
Well, first of all, I have no idea, but I suspect that Zaluzhny, who's been on the phone before with his counterpart in Moscow, has at least a rapport with the Russians. What that is and how well that goes, I can't evaluate, but they have talked. And I think Zaluzhny is being realistic and as open as he can. And Zelensky is permanently cheerleader for the war in perpetuity and has sold himself as Washington's man on the ground to lead the charge against Moscow. I don't think he can back down from that. He's made so many sweeping statements that are so ridiculous that he can't retreat.
Is it conceivable that General Zaluzhny would work out some peace agreement with the Russians in order to save hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives, no matter what President Zelensky thinks about it, pushing him out of the way? He's got the pipeline to Moscow. Nobody in Moscow will say a word to President Zelensky.
Judge, we're now in the realm that I would comfortably call the Twilight Zone.
All right.
Who knows? I mean, we could sit here and speculate about that, but I think there are lots of people that are willing to pull out their weapons and shoot people down right now inside Kiev in the government who might go that route. I think that they're stuck. They're going to fight. And perhaps in the midst of this fighting, there will be a call for some sort of ceasefire. And again, the problem is you're dealing now with a Russian government that has given up on the West.
Let's move from the East all the way to the West. Does General Zaluzhny have respect at the Pentagon? Does he have the ear of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or of Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, or of Secretary Blinken or Secretary Austin, somebody who can get to the president on the phone in a few minutes?
I'm sure that he probably has a line to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and potentially the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And remember, we've been down this road before with Milley. He leaked his rejected advice to the president to the New York Times when he said Ukrainians had done about as much as they can and they should negotiate. And that was rejected. And he was sent back out to recant and effectively sing the tune of inevitable Ukrainian victory. So at this point in time, even if he has a direct line, the man in charge is sitting in the White House. And I'm sure that no one in this administration at this stage wants to admit that they made a terrible mistake and put Ukraine's very existence at risk.
Your greatest fear, and stop me if I don't have this right, is that the man in the White House will pull an LBJ. And when his generals, when Westmoreland said to LBJ, we're going to lose unless we don't have another 125,000 troops, LBJ said, you got them. I don't know that Zaluzhny would say that to Biden, but what's to prevent Biden from saying, I'm using your language, Colonel, you wrote this, it's brilliant. By the way, for those listening to us, it's called Downfall in Kyiv and Washington, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. and it'll be available tomorrow at the American Conservative at their website. Colonel, your fear is that Joe Biden wants to lead a coalition of the willing, which is to be about 2 or 3 NATO countries.
Yes, I think that the people in Washington, and when I say people, I'm talking about virtually everybody inside the Beltway, has all drunk heavily from the Kool-Aid that says Russia is weak, Russia is incompetent, the soldiers are no good, the army is weak, we can prevail. We have to stay the course with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can still outfight them. And if we need to go in to bolster the Ukrainians and try to establish, under the guise of a no-fly zone on the ground, some sort of secure area in western Ukraine, down near the Polish border, in order to provide a safe haven for retreating Ukrainian forces or refugees or something else, we should do that, because we can still dominate the Russians if we need to. And that was, see, LBJ knew that he had enormous leverage with the United States Navy and Air Force, not just our ground forces over North Vietnam. We have no such leverage over the Russians. This is a pure continental land combat, and they hold all the trump cards. And we have very few forces, and we're depending very heavily, if we go in there, on the Poles. And while the Poles are very brave, courageous soldiers, that's an irrational act on the part of an American.
I mean, what coalition would there be? Who besides Poland and Romania would be in Joe Biden's army, and America, of course?
Well, I'm sure you'd have some British Special Operations Forces. Beyond that, who knows? I mean, the rest of NATO really doesn't have much to send. I mean, the force that was described in the interview that Zaluzhny asked for is larger than any of the armies in Europe. So what are they going to send? And the answer is, I don't think they have much to send at all. And now they've already exhausted most of their supplies of ammunition and weapons. They've sent most of that excess that's either now in Russian hands, and some of it is still with the Ukrainians. But the Russians have captured a lot of equipment, destroyed a lot of equipment.
One of our regular guests is an American named Matthew Van Dyke. Matt is the head of Sons of Liberty International, which he describes as all ex-military. These guys are young. They're all like in their late 20s, early 30s, who believe in the Ukrainian cause, who wear military fatigues, who are physically present on the ground. I don't know if they carry weapons. They don't shoot. They're not close to where people are shooting or being shot at. They're training Ukrainians. Matt sent out a rather startling tweet just a few minutes ago. Here it is. Ukraine must conduct a major offensive now. Ukraine has the advantage this winter in morale and logistics. Russia will recover by spring and will never be this weak again. The next 2 months are critical in this war. Don't dig in, advance. Now, I don't know if you know this fellow. He's a young man. He's on with us regularly. This is the first time I've heard him say anything like this. Russia will recover by spring. What do you think about this?
It sounds to me like some of the ideas that were hatched by Adolf Hitler in the spring of 1944 for offensives in the East, when there was no capability whatsoever for offensive action in the German army. Sounds to me like his thinking behind the Battle of the Bulge, when the German army couldn't fuel itself 100 kilometers without falling apart. So I think, I'm sure the man is very sincere and believes in what he's saying, but I think he's dead wrong. And there's not a whole lot for the Russians to do between now and the end of January for them to be ready. I think they're very close to it.
I want to go back to General Zaluzhny before I ask you about President Putin in Belarus. I want to make sure I understand the numbers. General Zaluzhny has about 190,000 troops, and then he has 200,000 trained troops and reserves. So if he wants, he has about 400,000 troops. Do I have those numbers right?
Well, he actually gave, and again, I don't know that these numbers are trustworthy. Much of what comes out of Kyiv has never been trustworthy. So take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, but it's Zaluzhny who has a reputation for being truthful, no?
No. None of the Ukrainians have been truthful about the conduct of this war. They've lied prolifically about everything. And he's saying they have 700,000, 200,000 in that category of fit to fight, trained combat troops. and then 500,000 of others, police, paramilitary,
Okay.
and so
Okay.
forth. Now, again, I have no idea what's going on. I do know that the Nazi enforcers are brutalizing people, forcing them into uniform, sending them to the front.
These
is a
are
very ugly war.
These are Ukrainian Nazi
Yes,
enforcers forcing young men, able-bodied or not,
yes.
into Ukrainian military uniforms.
Yeah, they're sending press gangs through Kiev and other cities at nightclubs, night spots, to see if they can find young men who may be there, and then pressing them into service. Sort of what the Royal Navy did in the 19th century and the 18th century to keep the ships filled. So I that's why I say I'm sure that Matt's sincere, and I do know that if you ask Ukrainian soldiers, they do speak very confidently of their future, as though they have a chance to really win. And you heard that from German soldiers right up until March of 1945.
Oof.
So I don't think that we should take that very seriously.
I would imagine that President Zelensky's people are regressively controlling the media and what the Ukrainian troops and what their families back home hear.
Well, I'm sure they are too, but he doesn't have to work too hard to control the Western media. That's already in his camp.
Already his. Yeah, the CIA has done that for him. Yeah. All right, back to numbers available. What does President Putin have available? Is it 300,000 that are about to add to the fighting force that's there now?
No, the numbers once again that were given were misleading. He said, well, he has 200,000 fresh combat troops, probably more than that. You know, I said a few weeks ago that the numbers by January could go up to 700,000.
Russian numbers.
Russian numbers. And you just divide that roughly in half, because about half of that falls into logistics and standoff attack and fire support. The rest of it are attacking forces that go in on the ground to kill the enemy. So I think the Russians are, quite frankly, already outnumber their opponents dramatically. And they have been training very, very hard. Now, you have to add to that number probably 75,000 Belarusian troops. And Putin, of course, is up in Belarus right now.
Right, now, what is he doing in Belarus? Belarus is another country, former Soviet satellite, but now a separate independent country.
Yes, but they are fully allied with Russia.
Okay.
And Belarus is going to provide whatever is required or necessary for the Russian forces in their country to launch attacks against Ukraine. As I said, there's 75,000 in that army, and most of that is deployed along the border with Lithuania and Poland. But they have a secure base of support in Belarus for at least 150,000 troops attacking north to south.
I'll tell you what I'm afraid of the most as I listen to you and our friend Scott Ritter, and as I read the media available to me, is that the president of Poland is crazy. And he's very, very anxious to begin a conflagration that historians will one day call World War III.
Well, that's again going back to the discussion earlier about a small state ultimately leveraging a large one.
Right. Will Joe Biden, who could get into Biden's head? Will pressure be put on Joe Biden, whether it's from the Pentagon or the globalists, to back Poland up?
Oh, I think that that's very much in people's minds right now, that Poland is the springboard against Russia, and that we should be prepared to use that in order to rescue Ukraine from inevitable destruction. That's why I wrote the article, because I'm afraid that we'll suddenly hear from Joe Biden on the television. Tonight, my fellow Americans, I've directed our forces to advance into Western Ukraine to provide a safe haven or something, a secure zone in Western Ukraine. And it's about peace, democracy, and freedom, all of which has got nothing to do with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And that's what we said about Vietnam. Only this time, you're not talking about Vietnam, you're talking about Russia, a great power.
If he does that, the Congress will do nothing. The Congress will do nothing. The president of the United States can't start a war on his own. I'm familiar with the War Powers Resolution. I think it's unconstitutional, but it is the law. But this will fall right into the hands of the globalists. We know their goal: to remove President Putin from power, whether by embarrassment and humiliation or death.
Well, that's why I think it's so important that people understand the meaning of what I've said in that op-ed, that whatever is said to justify a potential intervention by us in the western part of Ukraine should be dismissed out of hand as dangerous nonsense. The opportunity to do things differently ended a long time ago. If people were serious about trying to prevent the Russians from moving into Ukraine or deterring them from going any further than a few kilometers, we had that back in February, March, and April. We could have sent vast forces over there very, very quickly. Well, of course we didn't. And Judge, we didn't do it because they're not ready. And we don't have ready forces now for a stand-up war in Eastern Europe. So this is all dangerous nonsense.
Where is General Milley on this? I mean, what General Milley leaked was a truthful analysis of the situation. Then they made him do the mea culpa. So when that happens, I mean, the White House and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they must know that Milley is a realist. They can get him to mouth their words, but when they ask for his advice, I assume he's telling them what he truly thinks we should do, which is to get the hell out.
Well, on this occasion, I think he has told them the truth behind closed doors, that we should not involve ourselves in this. It's too risky. We don't have the forces for it. We don't have the logistical infrastructure. We don't have the ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. But he's not someone who is noted throughout his career for standing up for much of anything.
Do we have 4 stars in Europe right now?
Yes, you have a 4-star at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe.
And who's in charge of the 40,000 American troops in Poland?